The wind on the Yukon Trail did not howl. It was too cold for that. It was a soundless, weightless presence that killed, a pervasive crystalline chill that settled into the lungs like ground glass. It was January of 1898, and the temperature recorded by the few reliable mercury thermometers on the supply line to Circle City, Alaska, had held at minus 58 degrees Fahrenheit for 3 days. For the freighting teams, this was a disaster. Big Jim Houlihan, a man who measured his worth in the tonnage of his sleds, kicked the frozen carcass of his best lead dog, a Mackenzie River husky named Buck, though the name was irrelevant now. It was a block of fur-covered ice, indistinguishable from the other 4 dogs that had frozen solid on his chain line in the last 48 hours. His remaining animals, tethered to spruce trees in the open air, were curled so tight they looked like frost-covered cannonballs, whimpering with a high, thin sound that was barely audible. Houlihan was following the book: tough dogs, high-protein feed, and straw on the snow. It wasn't working. A quarter-mile down the frozen creek bed, Silas Vane's camp was silent. His 8 dogs were nowhere to be seen, his sleds neatly parked. Houlihan spat, a globule that froze before it hit the ground, assuming Vane's team had already been wiped out. But Vane's dogs were alive. They were, in fact, comfortable, resting in a series of low, unassuming snow mounds. Their shelter was the storm itself. What did this quiet surveyor from Minnesota understand about thermal dynamics that a generation of seasoned, hardened mushers had completely and fatally missed? The year 1898 was the apex of the Klondike Gold Rush, a period of human desperation pitched against an environment of absolute indifference. The North was not a place. It was an opponent. The entire economy of Dawson City and the surrounding Alaskan claims depended on a thin, fragile supply line maintained by men and dogs. A sled dog was not a pet. It was a 4-legged engine, a 70-pound furnace that converted dried salmon and tallow into miles. The manuals of the time, like the unwritten rules of the trail, focused on toughness. The prevailing wisdom, shouted in saloons and passed down by freighting company foremen, was simple: acclimate the dogs. Run them hard, feed them rich, and let their coats do the work. Shelter was an afterthought. The standard camp involved trampling down a patch of snow, laying a thick carpet of spruce boughs to keep the dogs off the snowpack, and perhaps, if the wind was severe, erecting a canvas windbreak or a lean-to made of supply crates. Some mushers, flush with cash, commissioned simple 3-sided wooden boxes, but these were heavy, cumbersome, and rarely made the long-haul trips. The experts, the veteran mushers like Jim Houlihan, believed that any effort beyond this was coddling. They argued that a dog kept in a warm shelter would lose its edge, its fur would thin, and it would be more susceptible to the shock of the cold when it was time to run. The goal was to make the dog as hard as the environment. This philosophy was killing them in droves. Let us examine the failure of the conventional method, personified by Jim Houlihan's No. 2 freighting team. Houlihan was a good musher by the standards of the day. He spared no expense on feed, paying top dollar for imported bacon fat and 500-pound barrels of dried Alaskan salmon. His dogs were the best stock, costing him nearly $200 apiece in Dawson. His failure was not one of intent, but of engineering. His camp system, set up on a gravel bar of the Yukon, consisted of a 12-foot-long, 4-foot-high windbreak made of 2 heavy canvas tarps, which had cost him $18. Behind this, he laid nearly 6 inches of fresh-cut spruce boughs for his 18 dogs. The technical failure began immediately. At 58-degree Curie, the heavy canvas became as brittle as porcelain. A gust of wind, what little there was, had cracked it from top to bottom. It offered no convective protection. The spruce boughs, a noble attempt at conductive insulation, were quickly compressed by the dogs, and their own body heat melted the snow beneath them. This meltwater then refroze, encasing the boughs and the dog's own paws in a layer of blue ice. The temperature inside Houlihan's shelter was 56 degrees, a negligible 2-degree difference from the ambient air. His dogs, unable to find comfort, were forced to expend catastrophic amounts of energy just to maintain their core temperature. They shivered violently, a process that burns fat reserves at an unsustainable rate. The first to die were the younger ones. Their lungs simply froze, the delicate alveoli crystallizing. By the third morning, Houlihan's team was down to 11 dogs, all of them exhausted, frostbitten, and demoralized. He had lost $1,400 in assets, and more importantly, his ability to move his freight. He cursed the dogs, he cursed the cold, and he cursed his luck. Silas Vane had never intended to be a musher. He was a surveyor, a man of calculations and quiet observation, sent from Minnesota by a railroad consortium in 1895 to map potential routes near the Arctic coast, far north of the gold fields. His first winter was a trial by fire, or rather, by ice. His civilized equipment, canvas tents, sheet metal stoves, woolen blankets, proved useless. He and his team were saved from freezing by a small band of Inupiat hunters. It was there, near Point Barrow, that Vane's education truly began. He was assigned a guide named Umik, a man who viewed Vane's expensive heavy gear with polite confusion. Vane watched, taking meticulous notes, as Umik and his family survived, and even thrived, in conditions that Vane had considered unsurvivable. He learned that the Inupiat did not fight the cold. They used its own properties against it. He watched them build their igloo, snow houses, but he paid closer attention to how they sheltered their dogs. They did not use straw or canvas. They built small domed structures from blocks of wind-packed snow, which they called kimmick. Umik explained, through gestures and simple English, that snow was two things: water, bad, and air, good. Powder snow was bad. Wind-packed snow, he demonstrated, was 90% trapped air, and trapped air was the best blanket in the world. Vane learned the physics. The enemy was not the cold temperature. It was heat loss, through conduction, convection, and radiation. When Vane arrived in Dawson 2 years later, his surveying job made obsolete by the gold rush, he used his savings to buy a small freighting team. Other mushers, like Houlihan, saw him as an amateur, a bookman. They laughed when, on the first cold night, Vane spent 2 hours digging holes like a gopher, instead of setting up a proper line. "You'll learn, Vane," Houlihan had bellowed. "The North'll teach you." Vane's first prototype was an emergency measure. A snap had hit on the trail, the temperature dropping from 10 degrees Celsius to 40 degrees Celsius in 6 hours. His dogs, new to his care, were shivering, pacing, and suffering in their standard spruce bough beds. He knew they wouldn't last the night. He searched not for shelter, but for material. He found what he was looking in a deep drift, 10 feet high, where the wind had compacted the snow for weeks. The snow was hard, almost like chalk. It was perfect. He did not build a block-style kimmick, as he'd seen Umik do. He didn't have the time or the proper knife. Instead, he used a technique for rapid shelters. He took his aluminum-bladed snowshoe and began to dig, not down, but into the side of the drift. He carved 4 separate tunnels, each about 18 inches wide and 2 feet high. The tunnels extended for 3 feet. Then Vane angled them upward for another foot, before hollowing out a small domed chamber for each pair of dogs. Each chamber was just big enough for 2 animals to curl up together, about 4 feet in diameter and 2.5 feet high at the dome. The design was intentional. The low entrance and the raised sleeping platform created a cold sump, a natural trap. Since cold air is heavier than warm air, any draft that entered the tunnel would sink and settle in the low point, never reaching the dogs. The dog's own body heat, rising, would be trapped in the domed chamber. It took him 2.5 hours, working by the dim light of a kerosene lantern. Houlihan's team, camped nearby, watched him, their laughter echoing in the still air. "Building a snow grave for him, Vane?" one of them yelled. Vane ignored them. He finished by poking a single 1-inch ventilation hole in the roof of each chamber with a ski pole, and then coaxed his dog teams 2 by 2 into the dark, insulated dens. The conflict between Silas Vane and Jim Houlihan was not personal. It was a battle of engineering philosophies. Houlihan's method was brute force. It was based on the belief that to survive the cold, one must overwhelm it with mass and heat. His was a philosophy of opposition. He used thick canvas, heavy wood, and massive inputs of fuel, food for the dogs, wood for himself. He believed survival was a matter of enduring hardship, and that strength was the only virtue. His structures were designed to block the wind, a battle they always lost. Vane's method was efficiency and accommodation. He was not trying to defeat the cold. He was trying to manage heat. His philosophy was rooted in physics, not folklore. He knew that a dog, at rest, produces a steady, if small, amount of heat, perhaps 70 watts, the same as a bright light bulb. Houlihan's method wasted this energy, letting the wind strip it away, convection, and the cold ground suck it out, conduction. Vane's system was designed to capture and concentrate that 70 watts. The snow walls, 20 inches thick, were not for strength, but for insulation. Snow has an R value, a measure of thermal resistance, of about R1 per inch. His 20-inch walls had an R value of 20, the same as a modern 6-inch fiberglass insulated wall in a house. Houlihan's canvas tarp had an R value of perhaps 0.5. Vane was building a passive thermal structure. Houlihan was building a wind-battered flag. The first true test came with the arrival of Dr. Eris Thorne, a physician and geologist retained by the Alaska Commercial Company to report on freighting conditions and the health of the contracted teams. Thorne was a man of science, and he carried a briefcase of calibrated instruments, including a low-temperature spirit thermometer that was accurate to 100 degrees Celsius. He arrived at the way station during the 58-day cold snap. He first visited Houlihan's camp, his face a mask of clinical horror. He documented the stiff carcasses, the listless, ice-caked survivors, and recorded the temperature inside the canvas and spruce bough shelter, 55 degrees. A complete failure of the system, he wrote in his notebook. He then walked to Vane's silent camp. He was skeptical, assuming Vane's team had perished or run off. Vane, sipping hot tea by his small tent, calmly explained his system. Thorne, intrigued, asked for proof. Vane pointed to the small 1-inch ventilation holes in the snow mounds, a faint plume of steam, invisible in daylight but visible to Thorne's trained eye, rose from each one. "That," Vane said, "is waste heat. It's the only heat I can't capture." Way. Thorne, with Vane's permission, plunged his thermometer through a vent hole, deep into the chamber housing the 2 lead dogs. He waited 5 minutes, his mittened hand steady. He pulled it out and held it to his lantern. The ambient air was 58 degrees. The temperature inside Silas Vane's snow den was +128 It was in 79-degree difference. The dogs were living in an environment nearly 80 degrees warmer than the outside world, using only their own body heat. Thorne was dumbfounded. "Mr. Vane," he said, his voice thick with frozen breath, "you are not a musher. You are an architect." Vane's system was a 4-part marvel of thermal engineering, learned from the Inupiat and perfected through his own methodical testing. The first layer was site selection and material. Vane never used soft, powdery snow. He used his ski pole to test the drifts, seeking the hard, wind-packed sastrugi. This snow had a high density of interlocking crystals, making it structurally sound and a perfect insulator. Its R value was stable. The second layer was the architecture of air. The cold sump was the key. The entrance tunnel was dug horizontally for 3 feet, then ramped up 12 inches to the sleeping platform. Cold air, being dense, would flow into the tunnel, but could not climb the ramp into the warmer chamber. It created a perfect, invisible airlock. Any warm air the dogs produced, including their CO2-laden breath, would rise to the dome, displacing the colder air, which would then flow down the ramp and out, creating a slow, natural, and vital air exchange. The third layer was the thermal glaze. This was the system's genius. After the dogs had been in the shelter for 1 hour, their combined body heat, 140 watts for the pair, and the 1 to 2 liters of water vapor they exhaled overnight would begin to melt the inner surface of the snow. This micro-thin layer of meltwater would then refreeze on the cold snow, creating a shell of hard ice, a coulis, on the interior. This ice glaze made the structure completely airtight, stopping all convective heat loss. It also turned the inside surface into a passable radiant barrier, reflecting a small amount of the dog's infrared heat back onto them. The fourth layer was atmospheric management. The single 1-inch vent hole Vane poked in the roof was not an accident. It was a calculation. It was just large enough to allow the heavy, toxic CO2 to escape, preventing asphyxiation, but small enough to ensure the vast majority of the warm, humid air remained trapped. It was a complete living system, breathing in cold air at the bottom and exhaling CO2 at the top, all while maintaining a stable, livable microclimate. The true climax of this technical struggle came on the night of January 12, 1898. The temperature, which had hovered at 58 degrees Fahrenheit, plummeted as a high-pressure system from Siberia settled over the Alaskan interior. Dr. Thorne's official thermometer registered 63 degrees Fahrenheit, the coldest night of the decade. This was the breaking point. At Houlihan's camp, the cascade failure was total. His remaining 11 dogs, already weakened, began to die. The cold was so profound it was no longer a sensation, but a physical weight. Houlihan, in a panic, cut his 3 most valuable dogs loose and tried to crowd them into his own tent, a 7 by 9 foot canvas wedge. The dogs, terrified and unused to the enclosure, fought, knocking over the small Yukon stove and setting a sleeping bag on fire. Houlihan, screaming, threw the smoldering bag out into the snow, creating a massive plume of steam that instantly froze to his beard. His camp descended into chaos. By morning, Houlihan had lost 4 more dogs to the cold and 1 to the fire. His team was finished. In Vane's camp, there was only silence. Vane himself, in his tent, which he had banked with 3 feet of snow using his own principles, slept soundly for 6 hours. He rose at 4 a.m., as was his custom, to check the vents. At 63 degrees Fahrenheit, the steam from the holes was freezing instantly, threatening to plug them. He calmly took his ski pole and reamed each of the 4 vents clear. He listened. From inside, he heard not whimpering, but the faint sound of 1 dog snoring. Dr. Thorne, who had not slept, made his way to Vane's camp at sunrise. He recorded the outside air at 63 degrees Celsius. He checked the temperature inside the same dog den as the day before. The reading was pleasant 19 degrees Celsius. The system had held. The 82-degree differential was stable. As Vane prepared a warm mash of tallow and fish, his 8 dogs emerged from their dens, stretching, yawning, and shaking off the night's rest. They were warm, fed, and ready to work. Houlihan had 7 dogs left, all of them near death. Vane had 8 dogs, all of them in perfect health. The impact was immediate and profound. Houlihan, a proud man broken by the physics of the night, approached Vane, hat in hand. He did not offer money. He offered the only thing he had left, his services. "Mr. Vane," he said, his voice cracking, "I got 7 dogs left. Show me. Show me what I did wrong." Vane, a practical man, simply handed Houlihan a snowshoe. "We need 2 more dens, Mr. Houlihan. The entrance must be lower than the bed. Let's get to work." The 2 men, joined by Dr. Thorne and Houlihan's remaining crew, spent the next 4 hours building larger shelters for the surviving dogs. But the real shift was in managing the humans. Dr. Thorne, seeing Vane's system work, realized the same principles applied to the men. The freighters were living in canvas tents, burning through wood at an astronomical rate, $100 per cord, in their Yukon stoves. The tents were thermal nightmares. 110 degrees Celsius near the stove, 30 degrees Celsius 3 feet away. People were suffering from lung scorch and frostbite at the same time. Thorne, brandishing his notebook, ordered the men to bank their tents. "Bury them," he commanded. "Use the snow as Vane does." The men spent the rest of the day shoveling, packing snow up to the eaves of their tents, creating hybrid tent igloos. That night, the stove consumption across the camp dropped by 40%. The internal temperatures stabilized. For the first time, men were able to sleep through the night without waking to feed the fire. The data, not the drama, is what changed the North. Dr. Eris Thorne's final report to the Alaska Commercial Company, submitted in March 1898, was a damning statistical indictment of the traditional method. He compared two teams over the 10-day January deep cold period. Team A, Houlihan, 18 dogs, conventional canvas, bow shelter. Cost of shelter, 18ths, feed consumed, 800 libs. Man-hours of labor lost to dog care, survival, 30. Dog mortality, 61%, 11 dogs. Asset loss, $2,200. Team B, Vane, 8 dogs, Kimmick Snowden system. Cost of shelter, $0. Feed consumed, 350 lbs. Man-hours of labor, construction, 2.5. Dog mortality, 0%. Asset loss, $0. The report concluded, the Vane method, adapted from Inupiat indigenous knowledge, represents not an alternative but a requirement for winter freighting. It reduces fuel, feed consumption by maintaining the animal's core warmth, eliminates mortality from exposure, and results in a team that is measly 100% operational in the morning. All company freighting contracts must henceforth require mandatory training in this shelter construction. The conversion was total. Houlihan, ironically, became the system's most fervent evangelist, teaching new arrivals on the trail how to test for windpack and how to angle the cold sump. Merchants in Dawson began selling specialized snow knives, a tool Vane had never even used, marketing them as essential for the Vane Igloo system. None andao da marur. By the winter of 1899, the trail looked different. The sight of dogs chained in the open, shivering on spruce boughs, had become a mark of an amateur, a chichaco, who was destined to fail. At every established way station, the landscape was dotted with the low, domed mounds of Vane's system. Cabins and tents were no longer built on cleared ground but were banked to the roofline, disappearing into the landscape. Silas Vane, who had simply wanted his animals to survive, had rewritten the engineering code of the North. The legacy was not just the shelter, but the shift in thinking. The North was not an enemy to be bludgeoned into submission with fire and force. It was a system of thermal laws. Vane, Houlihan, and Thorne had all learned the same profound lesson. Survival in an extreme environment is not about the thickness of your walls, but the intelligence of your design. It is not about how much heat you can create, but how much you can conserve. Silas Vane had proven, in the coldest place on Earth, that the most effective tool for survival was not a sharper axe, but a deeper understanding of the physics of snow, air, and life itself.